In this final video on the Greimas Square, I want to do a couple of things. So first of all, we'll zoom out a little bit and give you a broader perspective of how the square is used. And then secondly, I want to give you a final example, complicate the square somewhat, and address some of the issues and problems that come up when we use the square. I'm going to assume throughout this video that you've watched at least one of the previous videos, and so you have a basic understanding of how the square works. Well, let's think then about how the square relates to interpretation more broadly. So if we think about the Greimas Square, then the Greimas Square functions at a level that Greimas calls deep structure. So he refers to this as deep structure. And this deep structure works in relation to the surface level. All right, so there's the surface. There we go. And on the surface, we have things like texts, right? Stories. We might have myths. We might simply have society itself. And somehow the Greimas Square, from the deep structure, informs the surface level. So when we are reading a text, let's say, we can relate elements within that text to particular points on the square, right? So different things within that text can be related to the square. And there's a process of abstraction that's part of this. So we have quite a bit of abstraction here. And that's, of course, why the Greimas Square is a great example of structuralism. Beneath the surface level, we see this deeper structure that allows us to kind of make sense of what we see. We see a pattern that may not be immediately obvious at first glance. Now, the way in which we move from the deep structure to the surface, the way in which we move from here to there, this process is what Greimas refers to as manifestation. Manifestation. There's somewhat of a link here, I think, also between somebody like Greimas and somebody like Freud. When Freud talks about dreams, for instance, the interpretation of dreams, he talks about manifest content, right, the stuff that you see, and then latent content, the stuff that's kind of hidden. Although in Freud, there tends to be more of a distortion happening. So if we think about a dream, for instance, things don't, come to the surface all that clearly. We have to do quite a bit of reconstruction in terms of how things get displaced and condensed and all of these kinds of things. But there is some similarity in relation to these ways of thinking. All right, now there's also some similarity to somebody like Karl Marx, because if we think about this relationship between deep structure and the surface, it seems eerily similar to what Marx talks about. Marx talks about the superstructure, of course, right? Superstructure. And he relates this to the base. And I think Greimas does a little bit of this in his article on the Greimas Square. He talks a little bit about some of the social conditions. He doesn't talk too much about economics, although there is an economic square, obviously, that we've talked about in previous videos. But there does seem to be some similarity to Marx, although in this case the base appears to be much more linguistic, right? The various points on the square are really terms, they're ideas, and you can relate them back to somebody like Ferdinand de Saussure, who talks about binary oppositions, contrasting terms, all of these kinds of things. So at the surface level, well, that's maybe not the right word to use, but at the level of the square here, what we seem to be dealing with is a linguistic kind of analysis, a structural analysis here. But there are ways to make this more economic and to fit this into a kind of Marxist perspective, potentially, as well. Greimas does this a little bit because he talks about how this manifestation works. And he says, if you are an author, let's say, right? So let's pretend you're an author over here. There you go. You're the author. Then you're going to be part of society. So you are fitting into some larger society. And these two things, your individualism, yourself, and society, these two things influence, okay, they influence the hierarchy of the squares. The hierarchy of the squares. All right, what does that mean? Well, in any text or myth or society, there are usually multiple squares at work. So if we think of these multiple squares, they tend to overlap. And we'll just make a few squares here. There we go. Here's another one. Okay. Now let's add another one. So we have all these different squares. They could be an economic square, a social square, individual square. We've talked about these in previous videos. And they tend to overlap. But one of the big questions is, well, which one is the dominant, right? Is it this one, this nice red one here? Is that the one that really sticks out to us? That's the one that the culture cares about the most, or that you as an author care about the most. So the hierarchy then is determined by this combination of author and society. And this hierarchy of systems, there's a term that Greimas uses for this hierarchy. He refers to this as an episteme, which you might define as a hierarchy of systems or a hierarchy of knowledge based on a particular belief system. But the basic idea here is that different terms, different ideas are going to be ordered, right? And as these squares overlap and we try to analyze the surface level, it's really up to us to kind of figure out, as we backtrack, what was most important in the culture. So we're never really just analyzing one square necessarily. We're trying to relate different perspectives to each other. And in that sense, I do think you can make a bit of a connection to Marx. Certainly somebody like Frederick Jameson makes this connection. Frederick Jameson is the Marxist who most famously used the square in a number of books, such as The Political Unconscious, The Prison House of Language. So Frederick Jameson is very fond of using Greimas, but then also always with this attempt, with this understanding to kind of historicize the Greimas Square, to really make sure that we get down to the kind of deep economic, material base of society, so that this is not just a linguistic analysis of various terms, but the terms that we use are themselves understood within their context, within the culture. All right, so there are all kinds of other issues we could talk about here in terms of the Marxist angle and the possibilities that are there, but I do want you to be aware of that you can take this quite a ways down. You don't just have to stay on a linguistic level. In the second part of this video, I'd like to complicate the Greimas Square a little bit by looking at a specific example. And we'll be analyzing here how you might deal with a movie such as Crazy Rich Asians. If you've seen this film, then this will make a lot more sense, but regardless, I think you can still learn something from this. So in the film, I think we very much are dealing with a dichotomy between two oppositional ways of looking at life and thinking. The one is to be very calculating, so very calculating. Okay, we might even call this rational, we might call it shrewd. There are different ways to think about this. So rational and calculating. And the opposite of this seems to be some kind of emotional behavior. Emotional behavior. Now, it turns out that both of these things can be good and bad, and they are valued in different ways. So they're also valued, of course, in relation to stereotypes about being, let's say, Asian or being American. It feels like being rational and calculating seems to be associated much more with the Asian community, and then being emotional can easily turn into a kind of selfishness, a lack of respect for things such as family, institutions, etc. And that seems to be more associated with being American. But that dichotomy is constantly being threatened. It's constantly being turned upside down. And so in a way, there's no easy correlation here between each point of the square and particular things in the movie. I think that's a really valuable lesson, that as we construct these squares, we are simplifying, right? We tend to create these one-to-one correspondences, and so we have a tendency to simplify. If we think about the contradictory, right, so taking the negation of these positive terms, then the opposite of being rational or calculating here would be to act in an irrational way, to be irrational or naive, let's say. Okay, so to be naive. And the contradiction of being emotional would be unemotional. We might even say cold, to act in a kind of cold manner. So let's think then about where these different characters line up. Let's take a character such as Eleanor, Nick's mother, and she cares most about family, about making sure that the family stays intact, business interests, all of these kinds of things. And it seems like Eleanor is really a combination of being rational and calculating and seeming a little bit unemotional and cold. So we're going to put Eleanor over here, actually. And what we learn is that we can actually construct a second square. So we can kind of go like this. There we go. We can construct a second square. There we are. This will be a little bit messy. With additional points on the square, right? You can see that we have these 4 new points, and these 4 new points allow us to resolve some of these tensions. This is something that Frederick Jameson, whom I've mentioned in the first part of the video, does quite a bit, suggesting that what we really should be looking for is not these one-to-one correspondences where we can find exactly a rational calculating character, but it's more about how these tensions within society, within culture, are being resolved at the level of the text. And that's why somebody like Jameson refers to texts as in many ways romances, right? They tend to be romances because they romantically, beautifully resolve the tensions that we experience, that we feel at the level of lived experience. So Eleanor then might be a character who fits in over here, who seems both rational and somewhat unemotional. That, of course, is a value judgment as well, because that may be a Western perception of Eleanor. If you're Asian and you have this sense of family, that family comes first, then maybe her behavior isn't entirely cold. Maybe her behavior is more hot-blooded and full of passion because she really cares about her family. So the very way in which we define what it means to be emotional, right, is already culturally constructed, and that presents real difficulties for creating a square. One of the biggest lessons to take away from this, I think, is that how we set up the opposition tends to already reflect our own worldview, our own expectation. And that's that circularity that keeps coming in, right? The circularity of how we interpret. Oops, I guess that should go the other direction. So if we think about this top part of the square, this is where a lot of the action happens. And you can see this right at the beginning. In fact, the movie, close to the beginning, it starts with a poker game, right? We have this poker game scene, and you can see that the poker game is all about this tension between acting in a rational, calculating manner and then being full of emotion. And it's no coincidence that Rachel Chu, the main character, is a game theorist and an economics professor. She's resolving these tensions. She, at the professional level, is rational, calculating, shrewd, and so on. At the personal level, she's extremely emotional in a good way, and she tries to bring these two perspectives together. So that's why starting with a poker game is great, right? And the poker game itself, her own advice, tries to bring these perspectives together because she teaches the poker player, the other poker player, that sometimes emotions get in the way. Emotions can be quite negative, and you have to stay cool and collected. You got to go you can't just be afraid of losing, right? Because then your emotions get in the way. You have to play to win. So at this point, the poker game actually seems to bring her closer to this perspective, the rational and calculating one, which I think is interesting because it seems to suggest that we're trying to get her away from being too emotional. We want to kind of raise her to this other level at the very beginning. Whereas at the end of the movie, we end with a mahjong game. Right, mahjong game, very interesting scene, beautifully constructed and very symbolic. All of these elements are very symbolic. In that particular scene, we also have her making a decision. It seems very rational and calculating. She can't win the game, so there's no point in playing. It's all or nothing. And yet there's also this real emotional component. She does it because she cares for Nick so much, for his feelings, that it's an emotional decision at the same time. And one of the questions is, well, how do we reconcile these things? Obviously, the mahjong game and the poker game, we find ourselves somewhere in the middle, but we maybe pull to different sides in some ways. So we can say that Rachel, then, our main character, is the symbolic reconciliation of these two elements, these two things that are constantly at tension. And you can plot other characters onto this square as well. So to give another example, if we think of somebody like, quite a minor character, but if we think of Alistair Cheng, he is the movie producing cousin, and he is extremely infatuated, doesn't seem to care about his finances very much. He just blows money, he blows through money, whatever the expression is. He finances his own movies, people make fun of him, and his behavior seems too emotional, it seems too irrational. So he seems to fit on this side of the square as something to be avoided. If we look for a character who's primarily irrational and somewhat naive, we might think of Paiklin's brother, whose name is PT, so Paiklin's brother. And he doesn't seem to have much of a calculating spirit. He is very naive, doesn't seem to have any sense for business. He's almost like a dead end, right? And the idea behind this square is that we can see then what the culture permits, what is possible here. So for instance, at the bottom of the square, we're not going to find very much. There are very few characters who are entirely unemotional and irrational. That combination just doesn't seem to show up in the film very much. As a result then, most of the action is actually going to happen sort of over here in terms of where on the square we're going to be. We're going to find more characters in this quadrant of the square, and we can slot them all in if we want. But that gives us a sense of what's really important to the filmmakers, to the writer of the novel, gives us quite a good sense of what this film is really about. All right, to sum up then, a square like this may help us to focus our thoughts. It helps us to kind of get a sense of what a movie might be about. And it's even better when we have these scenes such as the poker game, when these contrasts between being emotional and being calculating are really thematized. They're really brought to the surface and we see them very clearly. And then we kind of go, aha, right? That the filmmakers themselves are aware of this tension and they want to resolve it somehow. But there are also problems, as I've suggested throughout this series. There's an element of simplification here. There's an element of coming in with our preconceptions, which tends to skew the way we set up the square. As we try to relate different squares to each other, how do we tell which one is dominant, right? Does the square sometimes leave out aspects of the text because we picked a particular square with particular values and now we're starting to ignore all kinds of content that's fascinating but that doesn't quite fit in with our preconceptions? And then the last thing to think about is, what have we done to these characters? Somebody like Eleanor, have we simplified that character too much by just making the character into a combination of one or two ideas? So, do we tend to simplify the richness of experience through this kind of structural approach? Hopefully you found this series fascinating. I love the Greimas Square. I think it's a great example of a structuralist tool. Not many people use this method in terms of literary criticism anymore, but I do think it informs still a lot of what we do as literary critics, and I hope that you will find it useful in your own work.